We're learning the second Sikha on Parshas Lecha in Chelek Chafei on page 54. The shir today is being learned by the Nishmas of Yosef ben Yamin ben Menashe Koltman. In Seif Hilchas Mile viert euch der Rambam wegen der Meile von Mitzvahs Mile. In the end of Hilchas Mile, the Rambam concludes explaining the advantage, the greatness of the mitzvah of Mile. And the Rambam says as follows: Kol mitzvahs ha-Torah nichrisu ala sholish brisais shenema chulu. All mitzvahs of the Torah, there are 3 covenants that were made with Yidden to fulfill the mitzvahs. Va'ala mile nichrisu shloish esre brisais im Avraham Avinu. Regarding Mile, there are 13 mentions of a covenant between Hashem and Avraham Avinu and the Yidden. And the Rambam brings the psukim beginning with Ve'etna brisi beini u'beinecha, the covenant between me and you, unrechentais alle brises, and he counts all of the times it says the term bris, a covenant, biz ve'es brisi okem es Yitzchak, till the final expression of bris in the pasuk of the bris I will establish with Yitzchak. That's the words of the Rambam. Now, as Mile is nichrisu ala shalish esre brisais, this point that there are 13 covenants regarding the bris is Mekayrai with the Kesef Mishnah Tzeichen the Mishnah Seif Perek Gimel de Nedarim. The source says a Mishnah in the end of the 3rd Perek of Nedarim where it says Gedoyla Mila Shenichresu Allah Shloish Esrei Brises. The greatness of Bris Mila, that there are 13 brises. The Rambam is a b'meisif of Lashna Mishnah. The Rambam, however, adds more than what it says in the language of the Mishnah. Aleph, as Yud Gimel Brises Nichresu im Avraham Avinu, that these are brises that were made with Avraham Avinu, and Beis, that is Mefaret, the Al Yud Gimel brises. Then the Rambam also enumerates what are the 13 times that it says the term bris by Avraham Avinu. Afal Pi, as das ist verstandig. So these additions in the words of the Rambam is understood. Val Mikloli Rambam is, as there is Maitik Loshna Mishnah Chulu, from the rules and understanding how the Rambam wrote things in his Sefer Ayad, is that he quotes the language of a Mishnah, but in Alza Sefer, from halachis is a kama pamim meisif from mevayir b'loshna Mishnah. But very often, the Rambam, since he's a Sefer of halachis, he adds and explains more than what it says in the language of the Mishnah. Kedei di halachis l'reiskum b'muzber ubara, in order that the halacha should be explained and clear. So the Rambam here adds details in order to explain this halacha. Von deswegen fordert sich Bier benitten die dann. However, the Rambam, and what he adds here, it requires an explanation. The Makar of Divrei Rambam, Oifim Avraham Avinu, the source of what the Rambam says, that these are 13 brises with Avraham Avinu, on of dem Pirut from the Yud Gimel brises, and also the details, what are the 13 times of covenant mentioned in the Torah, is Lecha in Yerushalmi Nedarim. So seemingly the source is in the Yerushalmi. The Maimon from Rabbi Yochanan bar Mare there brings a statement from Rabbi Yochanan bar Mare that Ksiv Bayemahu Karas Hashem Brises Avram Lema V'Gaimer Ad Ves Brisi Okim Yitzchak V'Gaimer. It begins that the first bris is in the pasuk Bayemahu Karas, and with the last pasuk of Okim Brisi Okim Yitzchak. The question though is, for was is the Rambam mashmit dem ersten pasuk? Was the Yerushalmi bringt by Yemahu Karas Hashem es Avram Bris Lema Gaimer. The Rambam skips the first pasuk that the Rambam quotes as the bris between Hashem and Avram, or befrat as the pasuk state in the parsha Friya, and especially this is a pasuk that's written in the parsha earlier on, and the Rambam does not bring this. Now, Pashtus, simply the explanation why the Rambam does not bring this pasuk, the Rambam rechentais Yud Gimel brises in parsha. On them pasuk by Yemahu Gaimer. The Rambam does count that there are 13 times it says bris in this parsha without this pasuk of Bayemahu. Is moving as a halt, as the pasuk is nit b'chlala. So that must mean that the Rambam's opinion is that this pasuk of Bayemahu Karas is not one of the 13. V'hatam, and the reason is the Rambam is mefarish in Pirush HaMishnayis. The Rambam explains this in Pirush HaMishnayis that the Yud Gimel Brisais, Hey Milas Bris Ubrisi. These are the 13 times that you have the word bris or brisi. Hanechpalim b'mitzvahs Hashem yizbarach la'Avraham Avinu b'bris mila. They are repeated in Hashem's mitzvah commanding Avraham Avinu regarding the bris milah, which was at one time when Hashem spoke to Avram Avinu about the bris. So we're only counting the terms of bris that were repeated at that time. Und da seine nur die welche der Rambam is mefaret. And therefore that includes only those that the Rambam brings and counts. Mashenk in the pasuk Vayemu hu karas Hashem as Avram bris leimar. However, this pasuk that is brought in the Yerushalmi that says earlier on that Hashem made a covenant with Avram, red wegen a bris, that pasuk is speaking of a bris. Aleph number 1 was is nit given b'maymed echad mit the andere brises. It wasn't at the same time together with the other brises that was said at the time of the mitzvah of bris. Nachmes is given behefsik kama v'kama shonim. Even more, it was actually a number of years earlier. On Beis was is nit given b'shayches mit bris milah. It wasn't said in connection to bris milah at all. No bris ben absarim oif nesinas haaretz l'zarei shel Avram. It's a term bris used regarding the bris ben absarim, also a covenant, but regarding giving the land to the descendants of Avram. So therefore, it's understood why the Rambam omits this pasuk. But based on this, it's not understood. On the other hand, why does the Yerushalmi quote this as the first of the 13 psukim where it mentions the term bris? The question is even stronger on the Yerushalmi. Der Maime Yerushalmi kommt maß besein, was die Mishnah sagt auf Mille nichresu shlosh brisais. The Yerushalmi is explaining what it says in the Mishnah that there are 13 mentions of the term bris. As it says it clearly there in the statement in the Yerushalmi that this is the 13. If you also count this pasuk, so then we have not only 13, which the Rambam counts all 13, but an additional 14th term bris, which it says earlier in this pasuk of Bayemehu Karas by the bris ben Absadim. So how do we explain what it says in Yerushalmi and really the difference between the Yerushalmi and the Rambam? In Mefarshim and Adog Kama Tirutzim of them. Commentaries give a few different answers for this. Aleph, one answer is Oich on Yerushalmi davshtei nit the pasuk Bayemehu Karas Geimer, nor the pasuk ve'etna brisi. In the Yerushalmi, the correct version is not this pasuk of Bayemehu Karas, but has to be replaced with the pasuk of ve'etna brisi, vi the Rambam rechent, as the Rambam counts it. That's what some commentaries say. But as in Rishonim, we find, however, in Rishonim as there's an amaitik fun Yerushalmi girsa anal that they do quote from Yerushalmi. This girsa, this version, as the pasuk Bayemehu Karas werd gerechnet als einer und erster fun Yud Gimel Brises. It is counted as one of and as the first of the 13 terms of bris. Ulapirusha. And now, therefore, according to their understanding or their version of the Yerushalmi, so Beis, there is another way they try to explain the Yerushalmi. But das Yerushalmi rech minit eine von die andere L'sheine shel bris so stehen be Parshas Milah. The Yerushalmi's opinion is that one of the other times that it says bris in the parsha, it's not counted. The pasuk as brisi hefer. You don't count the pasuk of as brisi hefer, where it's speaking about one that desecrates the bris. Other merechent den pasuk va'kimaisi as brisi itoy lebris olam als ein bris. My covenant will be an everlasting covenant. It's really only one covenant that is counted in this pasuk. Nit wie der Rambam was rechen sei for zwei brises. Unlike the Rambam that counted as two. So according to this explanation, kumtais as the Rambam is mechulik mitasa Yerushalmi. That the Rambam is arguing with the Yerushalmi and he does count them as two. But if that's the case, it would be possible to say that the Rambam argues with the Yerushalmi when es soll gewen am Mocker mein Chazal as the Yud Gimel Brises werden gerechnet behesem zu divrei Rambam. If there would be another source in another place in Chazal that the Brises, the 13 Brises, are counted the way the Rambam counts them. We do not find any other source other than the Yerushalmi, and the einzige Mocker is the Yerushalmi and all. The only source for what are the 13 Brisais is the Yerushalmi. Now the Bavli is Saisim. Und is it mefaret, welche sind Yud Gimel Brisais? The Bavli doesn't actually elaborate and say what are the 13 Brises. And the reason is, as there is a chsoymich of Yerushalmi, shekotem bezman la Bavli. The Bavli, that is relying on the fact that the Yerushalmi that was earlier already counted them. It's not the place here to discuss the details of exactly how and when the Bavli relies on what it already says in the Yerushalmi. But in this case, apparently, it already is said in the Yerushalmi, and it's not brought in Gemara in Bavli, and it's not brought in any other medrash that we know of. Is Mistave, if so, it's logical to say, as the Yerushalmi and the Rambam, that what it says in the Yerushalmi, the way the Yerushalmi counts the 13 brises, and the way the Rambam counts them, is nita pluk de beneim. There's no argument here. Not al derech, mara machoder, or mara machoder v'loy pligi. Each one is making a certain point about the 13 brises, and there's no argument between them. So this has to be explained. If the Yerushalmi is counting the pasuk different than the Rambam, so then what are the two different points that the Yerushalmi is focusing on and the Rambam is focusing on? Wenn wir das verstehen, behekt dem Abiyot in the zwei letzte halachis in Rambam Sefer Chesmila. We'll understand this by first explaining the two last halachis in the Rambam at the conclusion of Hilchos Mila v'zeh l'shoinoi in the erste von the zwei halachis. And this is what the Rambam says in the first of the last two halachis. Mu'usa hi ha'arla. The arla, the foreskin, is repulsive. Sheniskanu ba'agayim. The goyim, the nations of the world, are have this repulsiveness to them because of this. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, kikol hagoyim arelim, that goyim are called arelim. The term describing goyim in general is with the term arelim because of the fact that they do not have a bris milah. Ugedoylehi hamila, and the milah is great. Shalonikra Avram Avinu Shalem At Shamal. Avram Avinu does not get the term to be called whole until after the bris milah. Shenemar his halach lefanai vehayei tomim ve'et nabrisi beni benecha v'goymer. That when is Avram called whole tomim after the bris between him and Hashem, the mitzvah of bris milah. V'chol ha'meifer brisa shel Avram Avinu, one that desecrates and does not have a bris. V'hiniach arlasai, and leaves the foreskin oy mashcha, or extends it. Ava b'she yeshboi teira o maisim tovim, even if he has teira and good deeds. Ein loy chelek lo'olam haba, he does not have a portion in the world to come. Und danach in the halacha shel achrise, and then in the next halacha, and a halacha for itself, the Rambam continues and says, Boy urei kama chamura mila. Come and see how stringent the mitzvah, or how severe the mitzvah of milah is. That Hashem did not allow to wait for Moshe Rabbeinu even one moment, even though he was traveling on the way and he didn't make a bris for his son. His life was in danger even for one moment that he delayed when he was traveling. Then the Rambam continues what was quoted in the beginning, that all mitzvahs of Torah, there are 3 times a covenant, and regarding the milah, 13 times a covenant. Kanal Reish Sif Aleph, as quoted in the beginning. This is the full Rambam in the last 2 halachis in the end of Hilchos Milah. Now the Makar Aprotim from the beide halachis is the Zelbe Mishnah and Nedarim. The source of all these details in these halachis is in the Mishnah and Nedarim mentioned before. The Rambam is of a Mishana. Dem Seder und euch dem Loshen bekam dvarim. The Rambam changes the order from what it says in the Mishnah, and also the language in a few details. In the Mishnah is noch dem Maime, ba'usahiya arla. In the Mishnah, after it makes the statement that arla, the foreskin, is repulsive, kumen di maimarim, then comes the other statements, va'ala seder, in the following order. Rabbi Yehuda gedayla milah shenichlesu aleh shlosh esrei brisais. The first point brought is the greatness of milah, that there are 13 covenants. Then Rabbi Yisrael Gedayla Mila Shadeches HaShabbos HaChamura. The greatness of the bris milah is that it pushes over even Shabbos. Rabbi Shua ben Karcha Gedayla Mila Shlei Nitla LaMoshe Tzadik Ala Filim Loi Achas. The greatness of milah is that Moshe Rabbeinu Hashem did not allow even for one moment when he delayed. Rabbi Nechemya Gedayla Mila Shadeches HaNegayim. The greatness of milah is that it pushes off the law of not to cut off a nega. Rabbi Gedayla Mila Shekol HaMitzvahs She'asa Avraham Avinu. The greatness of milah is that all mitzvahs that Avraham Avinu fulfilled, le'nikre shalem at shamal, he's not referred to as being whole until he does the bris, shenemes halech lefanai v'hayei tamim. This is the way it's brought in the Mishnah. The Rambam bringt on it die zwei Maimarim as gedoyle milah wie sie doiche Shabbos and doiche negayim. There are 2 of the statements in the Mishnah that the Rambam omits the fact that it pushes off Shabbos, and the fact that it pushes off the law of cutting off a nega. In Hilchas Mile, gebracht halacha. Those two details were already quoted earlier in Hilchas Mile, where, as the Rambam says before, Mile bismano toiches HaShabbos, a mitzvah bris Mile in its time on the 8th day pushes off Shabbos, ubein bismano, ubein shaloi bismano, toiches atzaras. And whether in its time or not in its time, it pushes off the law of cutting off atzaras. So those two are not mentioned. But the question though in the order of the way that Rambam quotes the Mishnah is that something that we need to understand. Why does the Rambam switch the order regarding the other statements that he quotes? Zum ersten, in the beginning, gleich noch me'use hier arla, after he quotes the beginning of the Mishnah about the arla being repulsive, bringt dem letzten Maimer. The Rambam starts with the last statement in the Mishnah, that gedoyle hi amila shel nikra Avram Avinu shalom cholu, regarding Avram Avinu being called whole. La'achri zeh, then bringt betur Maimer b'fnei atzmai. The Rambam brings a statement for itself from the Sechta Avis, which is not from this Mishnah in Nedarim, but from the Sechta Avis, that kol hameifer brisa shel Avram Avinu cholu ein lechelik le'olam haba. That one that does not make a bris does not have a portion in Olam Haba. Und erst noch, and then after this, stellt b'halacha b'fnei atzmai. Then the Rambam starts a new halacha, and there he brings the Maimer in unser Mishnah shle nitta Moshe Rabbeinu aleh afilu shah achas, the statement about Moshe Rabbeinu that Hashem didn't even allow to wait one moment. Und zum Sof, and only at the end of this separate halacha, he brings them ersten Maimer in the Mishnah Mailas Amila as nichlur so aleh yud gimel brises, the greatness of Mila that it has 13 times the covenant. So why does the Rambam switch it in this order? Divides into two separate halachas. There's something here in the way the Rambam sets this up that we could see that there's a unique point that the Rambam is saying. So simply, it would be possible to say as follows. As the Rambam stellt them say that Amaimorim, the Rambam organizes the statements regarding the greatness of Bris Milah, behesem mit dem, wie the Rambam nimmt an, dem Chiluk betoichnam. The way the Rambam understands the difference in the point of all of these statements and the content of what they are saying, so therefore the Rambam organizes it in a different order. V'hainu as in dem zenedot svei sugi mailas. There are two categories of the greatness of the mitzvah of Bris Milah, but it's a telze in svei bazundra halachas. And because they're in two different categories, so the Rambam divides it into two different halachas. And the erste halacha, which is halacha ches, redt the Rambam di inyanim in Bris Milah velche zenen b'shayches le hagavre. The Rambam speaks about those matters and the greatness of Bris Milah that are related to the person that is has a bris, what it does to the person. Und der Sog is kailo de shlila, and in this category that includes also the negative if he does not have a bris. Das was ma'usi hiya arlosh and is ganu ba goyim, that if you leave the foreskin, then it's repulsive, and the goyim are called arelim. Und the chiyuv, and the positive, gedoyle hi hamilish le nikra Avram Avinu shalem at shemal chulu, that Avram Avinu was not referred to as whole until he has the Bris Milah. So these are all concepts that relate to the level of a person. Is the person repulsive, or is the person whole? Und der Rebbe bringt der behemshach lezeh, euch der Maimer from the Sechta Office. So therefore he brings here in this content what it says in Office that kol hamefer bris chule ein loy chelik loylam haba, regarding the person that he's not on a status where he has a portion in the world to come. Was has been some gavra. It's regarding the reward of the person or the place where the person is, that he will not be able to enter into Olam Haba. That's the point of the first halacha here, halacha ches, discussing mitzvah smila in relation to the gavra, the person. And the zweite halacha, halacha tes, but then in the next halacha, redt der Rambam wegen die Inyone benegeya zu the Meise chefze shom mitzvah smila. Here the Rambam is discussing the matter of the greatness of bris milah regarding the action of the bris and the bris itself, the chefze of the mitzvah of milah itself. Und der Fahr bringt die andere Maimore Chazal. In relation to this, he quotes the other statements that Chazal say. Shlei nitdele le Moshe Rabbeinu aleh afilu shah achas, an inyan in shlila. This is pointing out the negative, that even for one moment that there is a arla. So this causes that Moshe Rabbeinu's life was in danger. So that shows regarding the cheftze of the arla itself, or maybe the maisa of the mitzvah, Perhaps this refers to the mice of the mitzvah that Moshe Rabbeinu was obligated to fulfill, and he delayed fulfilling the Maisa mitzvah even for one moment. So this is something in the shlila, in the negative, regarding the action of the mitzvah. On kol mitzvah satayre nichlesu aleh gimel brisas chulu, and then regarding the chefts of the milah itself, the actual mitzvah itself, the quality of the mitzvah, that all other mitzvahs there are 3 times the covenant, and val milah nichlesu yud gimel brisas and Avram Avinu, and here there are 13. An inyan in chiyuv, this is in the positive regarding the quality of the mitzvah itself, that it's a very high level of a mitzvah, 13 times covenant. That's the way that Rambam divides and categorizes the different statements about the greatness of the mitzvah of Bris Milah. But according to this explanation, es ist aber nicht verstandig, it's still not understood though, what the Rambam is Mishana. The Rambam though changes certain things in his language from what it says in the Mishnah. Aleph, number 1 in the Mishnah, is the Lashon Gedola Milah. The Mishnah uses the term of Gedola, greatness, regarding the mitzvah. By Beide and Yonim, regarding both points that the Mishnah speaks about, Gedola Milah, Shenichlesu Aleh Yud Gimel Brisais, the greatness that it has 13 times the covenant, and Gedola Milah Shlo Nitlu Loi LeMoshe Chulu, and also the term greatness regarding Moshe Rabbeinu, even when he delayed for one moment. The Rambam in the Erste Halacha sagt Koloshna Mishnah Gedola Hi Milah Shlo Nikra Avram Avinu Shalom At Shemal Chulu. The Rambam also uses the term of Gedola, greatness, when he speaks about Avram Avinu being called whole. Aber in the Zweite Halacha, when it comes in the next Halacha, is a Mishane Meloshna Mishnah. Here he switches from this language. Und sagt, Boy urei kama chamura milah. Come and see the severity of the mitzvah of milah. Shalei nitla l'moshe chulu. That Hashem did not allow even to delay for one moment the fulfillment of the mitzvah. And then the Rambam continues with a vav that's connecting, that there's another point which follows. That all mitzvahs are 3 times bris, and here 13. For some pashtus l'shoina is mashma, from the simple language of the Rambam it would seem, as the word chamura, but sitzich oich zum zweiten inyan. This unique expression that the Rambam switched and said that there's a severity to the mitzvah of bris milah applies also to the second point, that there are 13 brises. The Rambam does not choose the word gedola, rather the word chamura. Why does the Rambam change and use this language? Additionally, what needs to be explained in the language of the Rambam is Beis, the second point, in the Mishnah state below is Gedola Mila Shenichlesu Aleh Yud Gimel Brisais. It just says this point about the greatness of Mila, that are 13 times covenant. It doesn't say the contrast. Therefore, Mila is greater than other mitzvahs. Was therein wird gebracht in Gemara b'Mokem Acher b'Masechta Brachas. That's quoted in the Gemara elsewhere in Masechta Brachas, where it says that Sarach sheyaktim bris l'Torah, that in the second bracha of benching, you have to mention both about the mitzvah of bris milah and about Torah, that you mentioned the bris before Torah, because shazu nitna b'shalish brisais and v'zu nitna b'yud gimel brisais. Since all Torah is only 3 brisen, and over here it's 13. But over here in this Mishnah, though, the Mishnah does not make the contrast, but the Rambam is medayik to say the contrast, the greatness or the severity of this mitzvah over the other mitzvahs that only have 3 brises. Why is the Rambam adding this emphasis? Gimel, third thing to point out, the Rambam bringt das nit mit den Loschen al derech Loschen HaGemara, kol ha-Torah kula nitna aleh, or nichlesu aleh, or nitna begimel brises. It doesn't say like the Gemara that says that all of Torah, there are 3 brises. Kulashayne free in Hilchas Brachas, as the Rambam himself quotes this concept in Hilchas Brachas, when bringt der Maimer Anal in Brachas. Nor sagt, here the Rambam is medayik, and he says, Kol mitzvahs ha-Torah nichlesu aleh cholo. That the mitzvahs of Torah have 3 brises, as opposed to bris milah that has 13. So we see that the Rambam wants to contrast specifically the severity of the mitzvah of bris milah in contrast to the other mitzvahs ha-Torah. So what is the pshat in this inyan? So because of these diyukim in the lashon of the Rambam, we must say that there's another way to understand how the Rambam organized the halachas and why he divided them into 2 halachas of halacha ches and halacha tes, different than the point that the Rebbe mentioned before, that it's a difference between the gavre or the cheftza of the mitzvah. But there's another point over here that the Rambam is showing us in categorizing it this way. So we can say that the answer in this is as follows. In Bris Milah and in Dot Zwei Inyanim. Regarding the mitzvah of Bris Milah, there are two different aspects. Aleph, der Inyan Klali from Bris. One is a general concept of a covenant that there is in this mitzvah. Beis, Bris als mitzvah pratis. But then there's a covenant as a individual, one of the 613 mitzvahs. Where do we find an example for such a thing? Valderech, wie me gefindt, bekame mitzvahs. We find similar also in certain mitzvahs that there are two aspects like this. L'dugma, by mitzvahs tefillah. For example, by the mitzvah of davening, der inyan ha'aveda from tefillah. So the concept of serving Hashem in davening was melernt up fun la'ovdoi b'chol avavchem, to serve Hashem with all your heart, or ba'avadatem esavaya lekechem, to serve Hashem, is ma'atzivuyim ha'kailalim. Looking at just the concept of serving Hashem, that's a very general command to serve Hashem in every aspect. That's one point. However, in this pasuk, there's also an individual command, an individual mitzvah. This is the command of davening, to turn to Hashem and daven with words. And therefore the Rambam does count the mitzvah of davening is one of the 630 mitzvahs. The Rambam himself writes, when he describes the rules, what is counted and what is not counted, as ein roy limnais hatzivuyim hakaylim hatayra kula, that it's not the right thing to count the psukim that are just telling you to keep all of Torah. Vitfila, like davening, which is learned from the pasuk va'avadatem la'avdai, which is just a general point of serving Hashem. However, davening is counted, while the Rambam sagt, because there is also something unique here in this pasuk, which is the specific mitzvah of davening, b'dibur, turning to Hashem and speaking to Hashem in davening. So we see in davening there are two aspects: the general thing of an expression to serve Hashem, and then the specific mitzvah of davening. Another example of a mitzvah is regarding tshuva. There's the general point about tshuva. Regretting the past and accepting for the future. It's a general command to follow everything that Hashem commands. And it's related with accepting the yoke of heaven. And therefore, as far as this is concerned, tshuva is not counted as one of the 630 mitzvahs. But at the same time, then there's a detail about how tshuva is done, where one has to confess, verbally confess, und das wird gerechnet in Rambam b'minyan mitzvahs. And that is counted in the Rambam in the count of the mitzvahs. So over here again we see the general idea of tshuva and the inyan prati of how tshuva is done with confession. Uns ist verstandig, another point here, it's understood as by Mekayim sein, dem Inyan miyuchad von Tefillah b'dibur, that by fulfilling the unique aspect of davening in speech, or the tshuva b'vidui dvarim, or the unique thing about tshuva, which is in confession, hat man nit nur the get the pratisha b'zeh, it's not only a fulfillment of the detail in this mitzvah, nor oich der Inyan klali von Tefillah and tshuva hakailol hatayra kula. But this is also expressing and fulfilling the general point that's in davening or tshuva, which includes all of Torah. It's turning to Hashem, connecting to Hashem, serving Hashem, or doing tshuva to accept El Malchus Shamayim. So when one davens or when one does tshuva, it includes in it both aspects, the general aspect and the more specific aspect being fulfilled right now. This is examples of other mitzvahs. Al derech zeh, similar, on Nachmer, and even more so, is Benegeya le Bris Milah. This is regarding the mitzvah of Bris Milah. This is a mitzvah pratis, eine von die Taryag mitzvahs. It's an individual mitzvah, one out of 613 mitzvahs. Bris Milah is aber oich an inyan klali. At the same time, though, Bris Milah is a general concept. Bris von Yidden, b'chol evareim v'chulu. It's a bris of the Yidden with all of their limbs, u'b'chol inyaneim v'chulu, all aspects of their lives. Mit Neibishten, a covenant, a connection between Yidden and Hashem in all aspects in general of their lives. The Signa Nacher, to say this in different words, says the bris ugemar kedushas Yisrael b'yed Yidden. This is the covenant and the completion, the stamp of the holiness of that there is by every single Yid. Al derech wie wir gefind die zwei Inyanim bad Goshe by Milas Ger. Similar to what we can see, and this here it's even more highlighted by the bris when a person comes to convert by Gatus. That in klali from Mila, als Geder from Gatus. There's the general concept when a ger, one of the steps to become a ger, to be converted, is the bris milah. So that's just part of the general change in identity from a goy to being a yid. The mid gater arayin in kedushas Yisrael. This brings him into the holiness of being a Jew. On milah als kiyum mitzvah pratis from milah, and then also the bris that he's fulfilling as a individual mitzvah of milah. Wie der Rogatshove is das mevayer. As the Rogatshove explains this concept regarding mitzvah milah. So these are the two different aspects regarding the mitzvah of milah, the inyan haklali of the bris, and also the bris as a mitzvah pratis. And as the Rebbe pointed out, that this is the two aspects of the bris that you have when you fulfill the mitzvah. Und da sind die zwei halachas in Rambam. Based on this, we can say that this is the division of the two halachas in the Rambam. In the first halacha, halacha ches, redt der Rambam wegen der minyan klali. In the first halacha, where the Rambam speaks about the greatness of this mitzvah, he's speaking about the general aspect of the bris in the mitzvah. Then klal is the Teichen from bris milah, the general content of the bris, wie das ist verbunden mit dem Geder kedushas Yisrael, as it expresses the general holiness of the identity of a yid. Und in der zweiten halacha, halacha tes, is the medubbe wegen der mitzvah pratis, dem Geder prati from bris milah. Here in this halacha, the point being discussed is mitzvah milah as a individual mitzvah. And what exactly is the severity and the greatness of this individual mitzvah of bris milah. And therefore here the Rebbe will elaborate and show us the difference between the two halachas. The far sagt der Rambam in the erste halacha. So therefore in the first halacha the Rambam says, Ma'usa hi ha'ar loshen is ganu ba goyim. The foreskin is repulsive, that the goyim have this and them. Shenema ki kol goyim arelim. That goyim, the identity, one of the ways to identify them is with the term arelim. Was the mit meint nit blois zum madgir sein the mius u genuss sheba arla. The Rambam here is not just coming to say about the repulsiveness of the arla, nor be'ikir, primarily the Rambam wants to point out as in dem besteht a hevdul zwischen goyim und bnei Yisrael. It's the bris milah which is the point that differentiates a yid from a goy. As arla is azach shenizganu ba ha-goyim. Arla is something that goyim have this term that identifies them. Und der Oiftu von Mila is as a shaft the shleimus in Yisrael, that this brings the wholeness to the existence of a yid, und the kasher abris von Yidden mit dem Eibischen, and brings the connection, this bond, this covenant between Yidden and Hashem. This is the general concept of a bris that distinguishes a yid from a guy. Und das ist musber in dem, was the Rambam sagt nach dem. And then this is further explained, as the Rambam continues and says, Gedoyle hi amile shel nikra Avram Avinu shalem at shamal. The greatness of the bris is that that's when Avram Avinu was called whole. Shenemar hishalach lefanei v'hayei tomim ve'etna brisi beini u'beinecha. What we see from this is the shleimus from Yisrael, the full identity of who a yid is. To have that full identity, the bris mit Eibischen, the covenant with Hashem, is durich milah davke. That's through the mitzvah of bris milah. So this is all in the theme discussing the general aspect of the bris in the identity of the yid and the general holiness and the general bond of Yidden and Hashem. Und der Rebbe is Rambam mamshich in the halacha und bringt the maimim in Sechta Avos. Therefore the Rambam here continues and brings in what it says in a different place in Masechta Avos, that kol hamefer brisa shel Avram Avinu cholo, when one desecrates the bris of Avram Avinu, and the Rambam says, and the Rebbe highlights, afal pi sheyesh by Torah o ma'asim tovim, even if he has many different details in the aspects of his life, in his connection to Hashem, learning a lot of Torah and doing a lot of good deeds, but ein lechelik lo'olam haba. However, he does not have a portion in the world to come. What do we see from this statement? Was does that here you see in a very clear way, bris milah verbunden mit dem etzem geder kedushas Yisrael. To what extent the bris is important for the very essence of the identity of the level of kedusha that Yidden have, because a Yid could be fulfilling all kinds of details of Torah and mitzvahs that create a certain level of a detail of a connection to Hashem, but not the very essence of the connection. The very essence of the connection, which is expressed in this, that he has a portion in Olam Haba, he's missing. That's what you see, Dafka over here, that we're talking about an aspect of Bris that's above all Torah and Ma'asim Tovim. It's the general connection that brings Yid into the full essence of connection to have a portion in Olam Haba. This is all the explanation of Halacha Ches. The first halacha where the Rambam discusses the general inyan of the Bris. And the zweite halacha, but then in the next halacha, in Halacha Tes, redt the Rambam wegen the Mila als a mitzvah pratis. Here the Rambam speaks about the advantage of this mitzvah as an individual mitzvah. As a fila via mitzvah pratis, even as one of the 630 mitzvahs. It still has an advantage more than other mitzvahs. Und das ist der Rambam madgish b'shinui l'shoinei gleich b'tchilas halacha. So to make it clear that here he's focusing on the individual mila of this mitzvah as one of the 613, he makes it clear by changing his language in the beginning of the halacha where he says, Boy ure'ei kama chamura mila. Come and see the severity of this mitzvah of mila. Nit gedayla mila. He does not use the term that it says in the Mishnah, the greatness of mila. Wie sagt in the halacha kedemes, which the Rambam himself used that term in the previous halacha, and v'lashon ha-Mishnah kanal, and as it says it in the Mishnah. What is this change of language? Here we're speaking about the severity, ba'oinish, as it comes out in a punishment for one that doesn't fulfill it, or anything similar in a severity, which means the importance in the priority of this mitzvah, and v'sulai. But it's not speaking about taking out the mitzvah of Mila completely from the category of mitzvahs and placing it into a general level of connection. No, we're speaking about the mitzvah of Mila as one of the mitzvahs and pointing out its level of importance and severity as one of them. Fun Mila, the severity of this mitzvah of Mila in this category. That means Mila als mitzvah pratis, the mitzvah of Bris Mila as one of the individual mitzvahs, und darauf passt the Lashon Chamura. And that's why over here, the right term is the severity of this mitzvah within mitzvahs. Und then bringt die zwei Inyanim. And regarding this, to point out the Maila, the advantage of the mitzvah of Mila as an individual mitzvah, the Rambam points out two things. Number one, Shlenitla, L'Moshe Rabbeinu Aleo, Afilu Shah Achas, Afa Pisha Hoye B'derech, that even one moment, Hashem did not allow Moshe Rabbeinu to delay this mitzvah because of its priority and its importance. Was weist, auf der große Harbkeit von Mitzvahs Mila, this shows how important the mitzvah of Mila is. Und nach an Inyanin, welchem es et, auf wie viel es ist Chamura Mila, legabe andere mitzvahs. And then the second point, that the Rambam is pointing out the severity of the mitzvah of Mila amongst the other 613 mitzvahs, Chol mitzvahs hatayre nichlesu alein shalish brises chulu va'ala mila nichlesu shloish esr brises. So in the language of the Rambam, he's specific, he's medayik and says all mitzvahs of Torah have 3 covenants, and the mitzvah of bris milah it's mentioned 13 times. So here's the answer to the Rebbe's question why the Rambam points out v'chol mitzvahs hatayre. Because the Rambam wants to point out the Maila of Bris Milah as an individual mitzvah amongst the other 613. So Vahainu, the point here is, as da rette nit wegen the Maila from Milah legabe klolis hatayre. The Rambam is not pointing out here the advantage of this mitzvah regarding Torah, the concept of Torah in general, and Milah being above it all. Nor legabe yede mitzvah b'fnei atzma fun alle mitzvahs hatayre. Rather, we're contrasting mitzvahs Mila as one mitzvah, comparing to any other one individual mitzvah. Mitzvahs Mila stands out and has a severity, an importance, a priority more than any one individual mitzvah. Was by jede von sei is nichlesu shalish brises. By each individual mitzvah there are 3 times a bris, on ala Mila nichlesu yud gimel brises, and by Mila 13 times. That's the way that Rambam quotes this, and therefore we understand the term of chamura. We understand the term of mitzvahs hatayra. And it explains also the order of how the Rambam categorizes the 2 halachas, halacha ches and halacha tes. In Mishnah, by contrast, in the Mishnah, when it quotes this concept, where the lashon is gedayla mila shenichlesu alea yud gimel brises. So the Mishnah does use the term of gedayla, the greatness of mila, that there are 13 times a covenant. Gedayla, the term gedayla here means al derech gadol shekoilol bekama mekaimis, The term gadol, which includes, as in many places, lefi in yonoi, according to, as it relates to in that area, b'shanim, regarding age, b'chochmeh, in wisdom, b'yiras shamayim, in one's fear of heaven, ba'anokim, in greatness, and giants. So the term gadol can be used in many different cases. Biz al derech gadol havaya, using the term regarding Hashem himself, gadol havaya, which means a level of greatness that's completely removed and above all else. So over here as well, the term gedula or gedayla that the Mishnah says, verte mit gemeint dem inyan klali famila. The Mishnah is focusing on the general point about the mitzvah of bris milah, that it's completely above and greater than the entire concept of Torah. The milah is an inyan klali in ganz Torah or mitzvahs. That milah is a general point in all of Torah or mitzvahs that expresses the general bond between Yidden and Hashem. And therefore here the point is that mitzvahs milah is greater than all of Torah mitzvahs. We're not contrasting this individual mitzvah to another individual mitzvah, but we're saying that it's greater than all of Torah mitzvahs. By the fact that there are 13 times the covenant, by contrast, all of Torah, there's only 3 times a bris. That's the difference between the language of the Mishnah, Gedayla, and the language of the Rambam, Chamura. Based on this, we'll understand the difference between the Rambam and the Yerushalmi. Because the Rambam bringt nicht dem friedigen Posik. Bei Yemahu, Koras Hashem es Avram Brisleimer. The Rambam does not quote the earlier Posik that's brought in Yerushalmi. Chach evert gebracht in Yerushalmi. What's the difference? So the point, based on what we learned until here about the 2 aspects of the bris, is as follows. And there's no argument here between Yerushalmi and the Rambam, because Yerushalmi is the only source of the Rambam. In Yerushalmi kommt der Maimer via Pirish und Bir of Divrei Mishnah. The Yerushalmi is explaining this, explaining the expression that it says in the Mishnah, which is Gedoyla Milah, Shenichlesu Aleh Shleish Esrei Brisais, using the term greatness regarding the mitzvah of Bris Milah, the Heine de Meile und Gedule von Milah als Bris Klali, the advantage and greatness of the Bris Milah as a general covenant and bond with Hashem. Was ist verbunden mit der Gede Kedushas Yisrael Bechlal, which expresses the general concept of the holiness and the identity of who a Yid is. Und zu dem Inyan is euch shaykh the pasuk by Yemahu Koras Hashem es Avram Bris Leimai. And as an explanation for this level of the bris, the pasuk of Bayemahu Koras that says earlier, not in connection to the mitzvah of bris itself, it says it before when it came to the bris for the land of Eretz Yisrael, but it also comes into this general concept of bris. Das Baden, the explanation for this is, Afalpi as the bris klali mit neibischen kumt bepoil durch bris prati. Yes, it's true that the general bond between a Yid and Hashem is through the actual bris, the mitzvah bris that is fulfilled. Durch ein Kiyum from the mitzvah pratis famila, by fulfilling the other aspect of the bris, which is the fulfillment in the mitzvah as it is as an individual mitzvah. Brisi b'psarchem lebris ha'olam, the bris and the flesh of the Yid forever. Al derech hanal b'tfilah tshuva, as pointed out regarding tfilah and tshuva that also have 2 aspects, but even the general aspect of the mitzvah of tfilah or tshuva is fulfilled by davening, specifically as davening should be, and tshuva also specifically with confession. But yet at the same time, is the bris klali faran by yedin. The general covenant, there is always there by Yidden. Including in a case when, for whatever reason, according to what Torah says, he cannot fulfill the mitzvah of milah in actuality. But still, the covenant of the bris does apply to him. The Mishnah tells us clearly in the beginning of this Mishnah that was quoted before with all the statements about the greatness of Bris Milah. The Mishnah Nedarim there starts off and says as follows: if a person makes a vow that I will not have any benefit from, and the term he uses is arelim. Who are arelim? Mutter be'erle Yisrael. He is allowed to have benefit from a yid that is an oral, that does not have a bris, but v'aser b'mulayakum. But a guy that was circumcised, he still is called an oral and he may not have any benefit from him. On the other hand, she'eni nanal mulim, when one makes a vow that he will not have benefit from one that is circumcised, mulim, who's mulim, Oster be'erle Yisrael, it'll be forbidden for him to have a benefit from a yid that does not have a bris, but a mutter b'mule yakim, he'll be allowed to have benefit from a guy that has a bris, or is circumcised rather. She'eina arla kruya ela l'shem akum. Arla, harelim, is a term that's used to identify a guy. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Kikol hagoyim arelim v'chol beis Yisrael ar leilev. That the goyim are what's called arelim, and a yid, there could be a concept of aral in his heart, but not the term of arelim that does not apply to a yid, even in a case where he did not have a bris. That's the beginning of the Mishnah. So from this point we see that the general concept of a bond between Yidden and the Eibishter that comes out in the mitzvah of bris b'poyol, but it's there by every single Yid, even if you cannot make the bris b'poyol. Now, umutem bezeh, with this it's better understood, favos the Mishnah bringt der Maime als Hakdome zu die weitere Maimorim, why this comes first, and as an introduction for what it says later on in the Mishnah, Ma'usa hiya arla chulu, how repulsive the arla is, and then Gedoyle hiya milah shenichresu aleh chulu, and the greatness of milah that there are the 13 brisen. The Rame is because the point here is it's coming to hint this idea. As the bris klali is be'etzem faran by yedin yidin. The general bond that is created through the bris is there in essence by every single yid. Now the gemara dover, the completion of it, b'payol or b'gali, that it should be in actuality and expressed and revealed, tutzachayiv durch dem kiyum from bris milah b'psarchem. That's when the bris milah is actually there in the physical flesh of the yid. But in essence, this covenant that the Mishnah is speaking about here is there by every single yid, even if, for whatever reason, he couldn't make a bris in actuality. That's what you see from the context and the continuation of the Mishnah. So the explanation, the reason why this is given by Meshni Yid and Avram Avinu, because this is actually the way it was by the first Yid, Avram Avinu. The bris klali zwischen dem Eibishter and Avram Avinu is nit given bisman und durch bris milah. The general covenant between Hashem and Avram Avinu was not only at the time of the bris milah, nor asach yoram farder, many years before this. The bris ben Absarim, at the time of the bris ben Absarim, where it says Karas Hashem es Avram bris leimer geimer chulu, geimer, that is, Hashem makes a bris with Avram Avinu, und das is given a bris mit Avram v'zarei achrav, and this level of bris which precedes the bris milah in actuality in his flesh is a bris with Avram and with his descendants later as well, meaning that even by his descendants they have this level of a bris even in a case where there's no actual bris in the flesh. But then a number of years later is given that Tzivi von Eibush and Savramin, then Hashem commands Avram Avinu as od dem bris darf man keveh sein b'psarchem, that covenant, which is the general connection that's there in the essence of the identity of the Yid, even before, should then be established in the flesh of the Yid, durch mitzvah milah, through the mitzvah of bris milah. On the far, so now we understand why is this oich hazoi by Zarei Achrav, that it's the same by all Yidden, by Avram's descendants. The bris klali zwischen Yidden und dem Eibishten is alamol kayim. The general bond between Yidden and Hashem is always there. Gleich kishanaylat, from the moment he's born. Oich kishameisu echav machmas milah und farle mal. And as the Gemara says, one of the reasons why one cannot have a bris when his brothers passed away from a bris, and therefore he doesn't have the bris, gleich wie wird geboren is bekedushas Yisrael. So then he has the full level of the kedusha of a yid from the moment that he's born, since he cannot have a bris. So what he says, verstandig, based on this is understood, as the Yud Gimel Brises was the Rambam rechnet is, that when the Rambam counts the 13 different numbers, times that is, that the Pasuk says the term bris, seine Betoichnam dieselbe wie die Yud Gimel Brises, welche werden gerechnet Yerushalmi. They are, in their content, the same 13 brisais that the Yerushalmi also counts. Nor, the Yerushalmi is makdim, however, the Yerushalmi first brings, and this is Hakdome La'inyim. The emphasis over here is the fact that it's an introduction. It's before the 13 that we're focusing on over here. And therefore it's really not part of the number of 13, because then it would be a 14th. but this is before the 13. So the Yerushalmi brings first as an introduction the pasuk Vayemahu Koras Hashem es Avram bris le'megomer, that there's the covenant that Hashem made with Avram, which was years before the bris. Because first, the Yerushalmi is pointing out the aspect of a bris, which is the general connection, the general covenant between Yidden and Hashem. That says, Vidas was nichresu Allah Yidgim brisses is madgish, as mile is a bris klali zwischen Yidden mit Neibischen. So the first point is to highlight the fact that a bris is a general bond between Yidden and Hashem. The Rebbe bringt als Agdamel then pasuk was read wegen the bris kolali. So therefore the Rambam, or the Yerushalmi rather, also quotes the pasuk of Nesati Brisi, which is it's the pasuk of Vayemahu Koras Hashem es Avram bris leimar, the pasuk that it says by the bris ben Absarim. The Yerushalmi brings that earlier, before everything else. But it's a hakdam, it's a separate inyan. This is the gedola of the bris, which it says in the Mishnah that Yerushalmi is coming to explain about the greatness of bris, that is more than all of Torah, the general identity of a yid. But then the Yerushalmi goes on to count all 13, and then you have to count 13 the way the Rambam counts it. The Rambam aber kommt in the zweite Halacha. However, here the Rambam in this second Halacha sagt euch mila als mitzvah protis is chamurem von kol mitzvah satire kanal. The Rambam comes to say that mila as an individual mitzvah is severe and has a priority over each of the other individual mitzvahs of the Torah. That's the theme, the way the Rambam brings this. The Rebbe hoton it kin art then pasik vayemahu karas Hashem es Avram bris leimar. So therefore, this pasuk of Vayemahu Karas Hashem, that's an introduction regarding the general aspect of the bris, that the Rambam omits here. Was red wegen dem bris klali, that speaks about the general bris. Sagam as euch das is faran and mila. Even according to the Rambam, definitely that aspect, that concept exists, of course, in the mila, which the Rambam spoke about in the earlier halacha. Now, fangt on from pasuk ve'etna brisi. He begins with the pasuk of etna brisi bis zum pasuk ves brisi okem es Yitzchak. With the pasuk of Brisi Yakim es Yitzchak, which are Yud Gimel Brisais, was Ale Nemru b'Maimedecha. These are the Brisais that were said at that time in connection to the actual fulfillment of the mitzvah of Bris, not earlier on relating to the general identity of a Yid. B'Negeya den Bris Proti Kanal. And this is regarding the Maila that there is in mitzvah's Bris as a individual mitzvah, that the level of the priority of this mitzvah and the Bris Proti in this mitzvah is greater than other mitzvahs. So there's no argument between the Bavli and Yerushalmi, or rather, again, the Rambam and Yerushalmi. It's just a different point that the Rambam is highlighting in this halacha, and therefore he omits the first pasuk that Yerushalmi brought as an introduction to the other 13 times that it says bris, that are the 13 brisais for the individual maila of this mitzvah.